Y'all may be seated. Morning, saints.
Morning.
Good, cold morning, sinners.
Morning.
I will take cold mornings over humidity any day, right? I have the insulation for it, so I'm okay with that. I'm wondering this morning about our two disciples from Luke's story, which we commonly refer to as the walk to Emmaus. Why are these two disciples, probably husband and wife, going home? Why are they making the 7-mile trek away from Jerusalem? After all, they were in the extended group when the women raced back from the empty tomb and announced the resurrection of Jesus early that Sunday morning. They were in the group who began to wonder what this all meant. They had friends in Jerusalem. They were safer together. Why in the world are these two disciples leaving Jerusalem? Why are they leaving Jerusalem? I think a key answer to that question is, when you don't know what to do, you'll always do what you've always done. When you don't know what to do, you do what you've always done. At home, they could go back to their routines. They could escape all the fear. They could remove themselves from the grief of the group. With their hopes crushed, they could pick up their lives and go back to how it was before. It may not be what they wanted, but it's what they knew. They were comfortable with it. In times of great stress, we normally go back to what I like to call our default operating systems. You know, when a computer crashes, it sets everything back to those default settings. It goes back to its preferred way of operating, and it ignores all of those customizations you had created. We're somewhat similar as humans too. When faced with great stress, we tend to revert back to what we know. And what we know is what has been built in us from years and years of life and experience in this world. In my pastoral training, I learned about this return to default, our default settings under family systems theory. Family systems theory assumes that we're all part of a system, which means that we are all connected. And a family is the basic example of a system. But this theory applies to companies, to organizations, to churches, and even to nations of any size. In this system, we learn how to be and act in our world. We learn how to function. We learn what is expected of us. We even discover our talents, or those talents are repressed by the system. Each system has its own level of dysfunction because imperfect people are a part of it. So we are each dysfunctional, for better or for worse. And this morning, we're here to claim our dysfunction. Amen, church? Amen. This is what I tell families who are getting ready to for those of us who are more aware of life and operating in the system, you get to influence what kind of dysfunction that you want to be a part of your system. For instance, you can raise your child to root for an SEC team, which is about the best way to mess up your child for life. You'll ruin them. Or you can teach them a better way. You get to claim your level of dysfunction. And some of these choices of dysfunction are made consciously, while others of these choices are made unconsciously, without our understanding. This is what I tell families who are getting ready to baptize your child. You are essentially ruining your child for Jesus. You're making them dysfunctional for Jesus. And why is that? Because you are promising to teach your child how to be kind, loving, caring, and respectful, how to live in the way of Jesus. You'll model for your child how to carve out time in your life to pray and to worship, and you'll show them how to be generous towards God's needs in the world with what God has given you. You'll meditate on the wisdom of the Scriptures, and you'll be skeptical of the wisdom of our world. At every point of your parenting, you'll try to choose the way of Jesus. And the hope is that your child will become an output of this system and will in turn live a full life of discipleship. It doesn't always happen that way because the world can and does have a more powerful influence than your parenting, but sometimes it does. Baptism is a great way to mess up your child for Jesus or to make them dysfunctional for Jesus. But we have to understand we're all a part of a system, and we're all making choices, consciously and unconsciously in those moments, on how that system's going to work. The disciples on the road to Emmaus went back to default mode. They had been in that system that Jesus was creating, but then he was gone. And in his absence, they reverted back to what they knew. Even though they had heard the good news of the empty tomb, it wasn't enough to keep them in Jerusalem. They were pulled by systemic forces greater than they understood to go back to the way things were. Yet on that road back to the way things were, Jesus shows up. He interrupts their dismay. He accompanies them along their way. And in the course of just a few miles, he leads them into the depths of God's plan of salvation as revealed in their holy scriptures. And it isn't until the breaking of the bread that they're finally able to see the trappings of their own system and the new way that Jesus offers to them. Our human nature is to be wowed in the moments by really spectacular events. And when the extraordinary returns to ordinary, we revert back to the way that we've always done it. Jesus wants to interrupt all of that. And I believe a main approach of Jesus, a step that Jesus asks us to take, is to grow through a group. It's one of Jesus' main ways to disrupt our revert back to the old way of doing things. We're in week 2 of a sermon series on our next steps after the resurrection. Just as the disciples had to figure out what they were to do with God's amazing defeat of death in the resurrection of Jesus, so too are we called to live in response to God's work in the empty tomb of Jesus. In a main way that Jesus disrupts our tired and worn patterns of doing life as we have always done it before is to invite us to grow in his grace through a group. And by a group, I mean a community of fellow believers who are struggling with the intersection of faith and life and who are seeking together how to live in response to the resurrection. There are a lot of groups that you can join in our wider community outside of these church doors, in this wider world, and they don't necessarily fit that bill. The church suffers from lots of competition in the marketplace of groups. There are plenty of community service organizations that you can join to make a difference in this world. You don't necessarily have to be a part of a church to do that. There are plenty of sports groups that you can belong to build up a sense of teamwork and fun. You don't necessarily have to be a part of a church to get that experience. For our youth, there are tons of online groups that they're invited to join, from YouTube to online gaming. That whole world moves at a faster pace than I can keep up with. They don't necessarily have to be a part of a church to find that sense of belonging in their lives. They can hop online from the comfort of their own rooms. But I contend this morning that those groups are all a part of our default operating systems, part of ways that we've done life before. They can and do offer us a sense of belonging and purpose and joy in life. Yet they fall short of what I think Jesus wants for us in life. They fall short because they can't get us to where the apostle prays we will make it. In Colossians 1, we hear this prayer of the apostle Paul. He's praying for this new baby church in Colossae. And he prays that they will discover the depths of God's plan of salvation, that they'll be filled with the knowledge of God's will and all spiritual wisdom and understanding. That doesn't happen automatically in life. Jesus disrupts our routines by inviting us to something greater and deeper in groups. And it's greater and deeper for 2 reasons. And these aren't earth-shattering principles here. They're simple gifts rooted in God's grace. The first gift is our growth in the knowledge of God's will in life. And that is grounded in our studying, reading, and living the Holy Scriptures. This is what happened for those 2 disciples on the road to Emmaus. Jesus doesn't come alongside of them and offer a new pamphlet on life through the resurrection. he takes them back to the basics. And he shows them how God's radical move of grace in the resurrection opens up a whole new level of understanding God's plans in life. I read a study this week about the habits of Americans in reading the Bible, and it was just concluded last year. And they found that the majority of American households still own a Bible. And in those homes, an overwhelming majority of people report that they want to read their Bibles more often. And this means simply moving from reading their Bibles on their own from 3 or 4 times a year to more than that. Not 3 or 4 times a week, or 3 or 4 times a month, just 3 or 4 times a year. They want to increase their growth in that. They follow up with them at the end of every year, and they discover this. At the end of every year, it doesn't happen for them. Their needle isn't moved on their sense of engaging the Bible. And this is held consistent for the last decade. I suspect a large reason why the needle has never moved for people is because folks are trying to do this all on their own. They're trying to do it alone. And honestly, left up to ourselves, we'll find other things to do with our time. We'll let our schedules become even more crowded. We'll forget, and we'll go back to our old default operating systems. Bible reading, however, does dramatically increase when people are faced with suffering or hard times in life. We need something to turn to, and we go to it in that moment. Jesus says that he is found in the Scriptures, and he disrupts our routine in life by inviting us to join a group that centers itself on the power of Scripture. This is why our groups are different than anything else that you can find in our wider community. We focus on the Scriptures, and we let Jesus speak to us from them. We wrestle together with what they mean or don't mean, and we listen carefully to one another to see if Jesus is speaking to us through them. The second gift of our growth through a group is through the relationships that are established. I think of the first disciples who all shared one thing in common, and that was Jesus. They were tax collectors, fishermen, slaves, business people, skeptics, prostitutes. They were people who normally wouldn't spend a lot of time with each other in the course of their days. Yet Jesus called to each of them to come and live life together in light of his grace. In our default operating systems, we tend to live our lives in our own little bubbles with very little interruption to them. And this is becoming even more so in our world today as we isolate ourselves, just being around people who look like us, who think like us, and who always agree with the things that we agree with. We don't want to be around folks who disagree with us. But Jesus seeks to disrupt that by inviting us into life in a group together. He asks us to make ourselves just a little bit uncomfortable and to sit around a table together, to hear each other's perspectives and to respect each other's experiences. He calls us to bear each other's burdens as he bore ours. He calls us to model God's love for each other. Growing through a group is the next step to which we're invited in life after the resurrection. Grace can be found there. And it's the sincere hope of your church leadership team that you'll find a group to grow in as you live out what the resurrection means in your life. And a bonus reason for growing through groups is the actual breaking of bread with one another. Eating with each other is one of the most common and important aspects of being human and dwelling in God's grace together. Around the table, you share stories, laughter, joy, you share your hopes. You hopefully find people who are there to support you and to care for you. You find an opportunity to slow down and just be in that moment compared to the rat race of craziness of our schedules all around us. There's a reason why this table fellowship is so important and why it's being denied in our day and age, and some people are trying to reclaim it and discover its centrality in our lives. Y'all remember that show, Duck Dynasty? These guys out in Louisiana just getting paid to goof around, right? Every show ended with what? The family sitting around the table. There's a show on, I think, CBS, Blue Bloods, and this is a very dysfunctional family. Oh, it's fun to watch their family systems work, but every episode includes them sitting together around the table. And it's not as always roses and things that are happening. There's a lot of tension in between them. but they're trying to tell us something about the importance of this table fellowship. Table fellowship matters in life, and it's being displaced by too many other things in our lives. Jesus is known and seen every week around our table here in church. And I know that he is yearning to be known and seen around your tables every day. When you don't know what to do, you'll always do what you've done. But the resurrection of Jesus disrupts what we've always done, so we can begin to do what Jesus has always wanted for us. The first step to following Jesus after the resurrection is growing through groups. And next week, you're going to hear from Pastor Kate about the importance of connecting every day. May God bless and keep you and lead you to a group to grow in his grace. Amen.